In this video, I want to continue exploring some of the differences between class-based components and stateless functional components. And what we're going to do is look at other built-in methods available on our class-based components that we can't add to our stateless functional components. These are lifecycle methods, and they fire at various times in a given component's life. So for example, when a component like Indecision App first gets rendered to the screen, when it gets removed from the screen, when something in the component updates, like the props or the state. Now, all of this is going to allow us to add in some pretty cool functionality. For example, we'll be able to populate the options array with data from the database when the component first gets mounted to the browser, and we'll be able to save the data as the component updates. So we'll be able to watch for changes to state, and when state changes, we'll be able to save things. Now, later in the course, we'll use a real database. For now, we're just going to use something like local storage. That's going to allow us to persist the data between page views. So to kick things off, let's go ahead and explore our very first lifecycle method. This one fires when the component first gets mounted to the DOM. That is known as component did mount. Now, once again, like render, the naming is very important here. We are never going to explicitly call this. It gets called internally. So if you're off by even one character, like you have an extra T, the React component code is not going to know that, and it's not going to end up firing the lifecycle method. So do check your spelling on these. If they are not firing, we're going to set up this method, and we're just going to add in a little console.log. Console.log component did mount. Excellent. Now, if we go ahead and actually run the application, we should see it show up in the console. Why? Because we mount a single instance of Indecision App. So right there, we get a single instance of our component did mount message. Now, this is something that we only have access to in our class-based components. There is no way to manage lifecycle for stateless functional components. So if you do need to use lifecycle, you're going to want to use a class-based component. Now, this is actually another reason why stateless functional components are so fast. When we first explored them, I mentioned they don't have to manage any state. There is no infrastructure for that, which speeds them up. And they also don't have to manage any lifecycle, which once again speeds them up. But if you do need lifecycle, component did mount and related methods are definitely the way to get that done. Another lifecycle method that we're going to be taking advantage of is component did update. And component did update is going to fire after the component updates. So after the state values change or after the prop values change. And that's going to be really handy for our purposes. That means we can do something when the options array changes. For now, though, we can just go ahead and use console.log to print component did update. Now, if we go ahead and save app.js, by default, we're not going to see this message. Component did update only fires after the props or state values change. So for our purposes, we can cause an update by changing the options state. I'm going to add a new item, ABC, hit enter, and right here we have an instance of component did update showing up to the screen. And if I added another one, we would get the exact same thing. Now the message has shown up twice. The same is true if we remove items. If I remove an individual item, we see it fires 3 times. And if I were to add another one back in, once again, it fires. Now, if I remove all, we are removing 2 items, but that's still just one update. We're going from an array of 2 to an array of 0. So it's going to fire just one more time, bringing the total up to 5. Component did update is going to be really useful when it comes to figuring out exactly when your component's data has changed. Inside of the method itself, we have access to this.state and this.props for the new state and new prop values, but we actually also have a couple of arguments which allow us to access the previous props and the previous state. The first one is the previous prop object, which is commonly called prevprops, though you could call it anything you like. And the second argument is the previous state. So that's the object prev state. And we can go ahead and use these inside of component did update to do something meaningful, like figure out if a specific part of a component updated. So if we have a search term and we have other parts of the application that are changing, we might not always want to save options every time component did update fires. Maybe we only want to save options if the options array length actually changed, and previous state is going to give us access to the old length, and we can compare it to the new one. We'll focus on that in a little bit. There is one more lifecycle method I do want to cover. That is the lifecycle method that fires when a component goes away. That is, component will unmount. So this fires just before your component goes away, and it's going to allow us to do something meaningful. Now, I usually don't have much of a purpose for component will unmount. There's usually nothing I need to clean up, and we're going to find it barely used at all throughout the course, but it is important to know it exists. Console.log, right here, component will unmount. Now, if we save app.js over inside of the browser, we're going to see our component did mount message, but we're never going to see our component will unmount message. Now, some of our components do get unmounted. For example, individual options that get removed, those do indeed go away, but everything else stays the same. Now, if we had an application with multiple pages, which we will later on in the course, we would get component will unmount when we switched pages and rendered something completely new. For now, though, we can go ahead and just trigger this right inside of the Chrome console. We can use React DOM .render to render something. We are going to render a call to React.create element. Right here, we can just pass in the string p. We're creating a very simple p tag with no content and no props. And finally, as the second argument to React DOM.render, we will access document.getElementById, fetching the div with the ID of app. Awesome. Now this line is going to replace our entire application with an empty paragraph tag, and when we run it, you can see everything goes away and component will unmount fires. So component will unmount fires when a given component disappears, when it gets unmounted from the screen, and that's something that we're going to see more and more as we create more dynamic real-world applications. Now, these three aren't the only three lifecycle methods available to you. We can learn more by heading over to Google and Googling React component lifecycle. If we do that, we should get brought over to the React component documentation. And on here, one of the sections is actually all about the lifecycle. It's going to walk us through all of the methods that we have access to. It's right down here, the component lifecycle. Up above, there's an overview. This is stuff we've already seen before, a basic class-based component. Down here, though, it walks you through the three various phases of the component's lifecycle: mounting, updating, and unmounting. Now, for unmounting, there's only one, and we've already explored it. Component will unmount. For mounting, there are four. We've explored three. First up, the constructor fires. Then, between when the constructor fires and when the app actually renders, we get a call to component will mount. After render, which we've used before, we get another one we've used before, component did mount. Inside of updating, we have even more, only two of which we've used. We've used render, and we've used component did update. These three guys can be useful in certain situations, and we'll be exploring them throughout the course, but for now, there's no need to add all of these onto the component and watch them fire. If you do want to learn more about any of these, you can just click it, and it'll bring you down to the documentation, talking about exactly how to use it, when it fires, and what it's good for. I'm going to shut that down, and what I'd like to do next is actually save and fetch data using local storage. So that's going to be the first way we store data. Later on, we'll worry about integrating a real database. That means in component did mount, what we're going to be doing is fetching data. And inside of component did update, what we're really going to be doing is saving data. Using these two mechanisms, we'll be able to save all of the data the user enters, whether they add or remove items, and when they come back to the application, we'll be able to fetch the last saved data, repopulating the list with all of the options they had in place. Now we're going to focus on setting that up with local storage in the next video. Don't worry, there will be a challenge that requires you to use lifecycle methods on your own. That's coming up in a little bit. Let's take just a quick moment to recap what we learned in this one. In this video, we learned that there is something called lifecycle methods. Lifecycle methods like component did mount, component did update, and component will unmount fire at various times in the component's lifecycle. And these are really handy for a lot of situations. We also learned that they're only available in class-based components. Stateless functional components, they do not have access to lifecycle methods. All they have access to is the equivalent of render. They can choose to render some stuff to the screen, but they can't do stuff like set up custom methods, define lifecycle methods, or use component state. So that is it for this one. In the next video, we're actually going to make these lifecycle methods useful. I'll see you then.